Hi there, it's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and it's the May garden tour. And I'm going to be looking at jobs in the garden in May, but also a few jobs that actually I should have done 2 or 3 weeks ago, or even a month or so ago, and looking at whether I can do them now or whether in fact I have to wait. I don't know about you, but I find that I don't always get my garden jobs done exactly when I ought to get them done. And then of course I'm facing some sort of overgrown shrub and then thinking, well, is this the right time to prune it? The Middlesized Garden is a walled town garden, and it's about 100 feet long. And it's 80 feet wide at its widest, but it's an L shape, so it's 40 feet wide nearer the house. It's been probably the sunniest April on record, and temperatures have regularly been at about 20 Celsius, 68 Fahrenheit, or even higher day after day, which has been lovely to be out in it, but it's been quite challenging in the garden. So, garden jobs for May. Well, firstly, the daffodils are all over, and it is time to lift and divide those daffodils, particularly once their green leaves have died away. Now, I haven't done this for about 4 or 5 years, and so I do have to do it this year, because if daffodils get too congested, then they can go what's called blind, which means you get lots of green leaf and no flower. So that is something I have to do, and I will have to do it in the next maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Some of the shrubs should probably have been pruned in the winter, but I don't want to prune them now because the birds are already nesting. These 3 shrubs are really just great lumps of greenery, but they can stay great lumps of greenery until about August, because most of the fledglings, most of the nests will all be empty by August. Even birds that go for a second family in 1 year will be pretty much through by August. So these shrubs need to stay like great big green lumps for the next few months. However, there are some spring flowering shrubs which do have to be pruned immediately after they flower. And for example, this spirea here we allowed to get very dense, and last autumn we actually hacked away an enormous amount of it, and I thought it might die, but actually, in spite of the fact that we probably hacked away 7/8 of it last autumn, you can see the flowers are absolutely beautiful here. And for this shrub I'll need to take out 1 branch in every 3 after it's flowered. The lovely white pom-poms of Viburnum opulus, or the snowball bush, are out, but this is a plant which I have neglected. It's such a lovely plant, it's so easy care, but I should have pruned it immediately after flowering over the last few years, and I haven't. I just forgot about it. And so what's happened there is that all the flowers now are at the top of the plant. A few years ago, the flowers were, all over the plant. It was really a lovely presence in the garden. But if you look at it now, you can see that about the top third has got lovely white flowers, and below that it's green. And that's because I didn't prune it. So that's definitely on the list. Once again, for maybe 2 to 3 weeks' time, I'll prune it very carefully. And I know there are no birds nesting in there. It's also the time of year to start checking your viburnum to see if viburnum beetle are in there. I don't like to use chemical insecticides because it can affect the other insects. So at this time of year I try and pick off the leaves that show damage from viburnum beetle. You can see they look a bit nibbled, and then I throw them away somewhere where the viburnum beetle grubs can't get out and infect something else. But on the whole, that will only keep them back to a certain extent. You're not going to get rid of them completely that way. But I would rather have some nibbled leaves and not destroy other insects. The difficulty is slightly with evergreen hedges, because it is a good time to prune evergreen hedges. You're much less likely to get bald patches like this if you prune them in the late spring. However, the birds are definitely nesting in this evergreen hedge, and so I'm not going to prune it. I'd rather have bald patches than turn poor birds out of their nests when they've got little babies in there. This tree is an ornamental cherry, and like many garden fruit trees, it's been grafted onto a different rootstock. And usually what happens is it's grafted onto a different rootstock so it doesn't grow so big in a small garden. But what can happen is that the tree starts to grow from those grafted roots. And you can see here that this is a dark-leafed cherry, but if you look at some of those lower branches and saplings that are popping out from the root and from lower down, is those are bright green. And if you want to keep the dark leaves, it's important to chop those bright green ones off, and that's something you need to do as soon as you see it. Another job I'm a bit late with is feeding my roses. Now, most of the garden, your established plants don't really need feeding. in most of the garden. If you give your garden a layer of well-rotted manure or garden compost at least once a year, then your soil will be healthy and most of your plants will thrive, provided they're the right plants for the part of the world you live in. But there are a few plants that are very hungry, and vegetables are one of them, but roses are definitely another. And I know a lot of people are often very disappointed to see that their roses have sort of scant, skimpy foliage and they've got black spots and they look, the flowers are beautiful, but the actual plant themselves isn't. And one of the things you can do to help this is to feed your roses. And you're supposed to do a feed in March. I didn't. I usually do. But I'm certainly going to do it now. There's no problem with making a late feed. In fact, I'm going to use a liquid feed, which you can use on your roses every 7 to 10 days. Sometimes I use a granular long-term feed. So I just put a little handful of rose feed into the soil and that feeds the plant for the whole of the season. But I'm going to use a liquid feed called Empathy because I've been sent it for review, and that needs to be diluted in a watering can and then used to water the roots of the plant about every 7 to 10 days. And weeding. If there's one thing that you need to keep an eye on in your May garden, it's the weeds. I did a video on this, and one of your approaches to weeds could be actually to declassify some plants as weeds. And if they're very vigorous and very pretty, and you would normally call them weeds, but you like them, then leave them in there and don't weed. But otherwise, for the pernicious plants, for things like bindweed and ground elder and couch grass, absolutely nothing beats getting out there every day and just pulling up a few. Just do a little patrol of the garden first thing in the morning with your cup of coffee, and if you see a bindweed stem, just tweak it out. So that's something I'm trying to be better about this year, because I did let the ground elder get away from me last year. We mow the lawn all year round because we live in quite a mild climate, and it makes the garden look much better to keep the garden lightly mowed in winter. But now, of course, it's time to go to summer mowing, and that's usually weekly. Mowing is the only care we do for our lawn. I know a lot of people will weed and feed, or they will scarify and aerate and other things, and we don't. And although our lawn looks good from a distance, I do feel that it's only fair to show you a close-up of the fact that it's not brilliant. We try to be as wildlife friendly as we can, and the most important thing, of course, is to have a source of water. So we have 2 or 3 mini ponds, and because it's been so dry, it has been important to keep those topped up. But otherwise, a properly made mini pond is very little work. I've got a video which I'll put in the description below about how to make a mini pond, and I've got this one here which has been very little trouble for the past 3 or 4 years. I just have to pick out fallen leaves to stop them rotting away. If the vegetation is getting a bit thick at this time of year, you can pull some of it out, but leave it on the side for about 24 hours in case there are tiny creatures in there and they need to crawl back in. I potted up some dahlias that I'd kept over the winter in March, and they are now about ready to be planted out, but I actually might just pot them up into slightly larger pots and then bury the pots in the border. I'm not quite sure whether I'll do that, but obviously I'll talk about that in perhaps the July or August garden tours and see if that's worked. But the biggest job in May has been repotting my potted plants in big pots, and I worried that I had actually left this a bit late. Having checked online with authorities like the RHS, I can see that you can repot plants in pots at any time in spring or summer when they get overcrowded. In fact, you can repot them at any time of year. You just have to be a bit careful in autumn and winter that they don't get waterlogged in their new compost. After a year or two, most plants get very congested in a pot and their roots go round and round, and it's either time to pot them into a larger pot, or if you don't want to do that, is to haul them out and give them a root prune. We started off with these 2 phormiums, and I have to say it took about 15 minutes of wrestling in order to sort of get all the roots untangled, to cut the roots back, to get the old soil out from the roots, and then eventually replant them again into a pot with new soil. And really, you should be doing that to all of your plants in pots pretty much every year. But I must admit, I haven't, and they've still looked good, but there comes a point when you really do need to do it. But of course, I do think that gardens in May are perhaps the most beautiful gardens of all. And some of the things that I have really enjoyed and which I would really recommend to think about having for your garden in early summer is, of course, the fruit blossom. This crabapple blossom, Malus hupahensis, has just been outstanding this year. And these trees were grown from a pip about 10 years ago by a friend of mine, and they are now about 25 feet tall. And I think what that shows is that you really can grow things like fruit trees from pips, and they'll be much happier because they've always been in that soil. These Malus hupahensis don't really know any other home. Whereas if I had bought them from a fruit tree grower, they would have had to just settle in and adapt a bit more. The quince is just so beautiful in May, and I did buy it from a quince tree grower and it's been perfectly happy. It's a lovely tree. Quince, crabapple, medlar, all of those trees are just so beautiful, and they're so wonderful for wildlife. They're great for pollinators, and then you get the fruit and you can make jams and jellies of it in the autumn, and often they've got great autumn colour too. So if you've got room for a fruit tree in your garden, I can really recommend it. And another plant that I'd rather like to recommend is cerinthy, which you can see here in this bunch. I grew some cerinthy from seed about 8 years ago, and I just planted 2 or 3 out in the garden, and it's self-seeded ever since, and it comes out at this time of year when there aren't many annuals out, and the bees and pollinators just love it, and it's so pretty. So actually I'd really recommend cerinthy as well. And of course, one of the joys at this time of year is the emerging leaves. If you watch my videos regularly, you know that this tree, which is called Cotinus cagaria grace, or smoke bush grace, has actually been dying, and huge chunks of it die back. We've cut it down. It's in the middle of a border, so it's not a risk to anyone walking past. And this tree is in a dying phase, which is common in trees. Trees spend a growing phase, a mature phase, and a dying phase, and each of those phases can be 10 or 20 years long. So we're keeping it in the garden because this emerging leaf is so beautiful. We'll have to accept at some point that it will go, but it is still a wonderful part of the garden, provided that we can keep it low enough so that it's safe. The leaves next to it are Amelantia lamarckii, and the very, very bright green is called Smyrnium perfoliatum. I don't think Smyrnium has got a common name. I bought this as a plant from Great Dixter, and I planted it, and it has self-seeded everywhere. It just goes absolutely everywhere. It's wonderful at this time of year. And then it dies away completely by about July. So you can have it in a border where you then plant something else. It's a wonderful plant. Lots of people ask me what this dark purple-leafed plant in the middle is that comes up like a huge great ball. It's a rather wonderful plant. It's called Chemiset rector, and it comes up in a sort of really almost tailored ball at this time of year, and then suddenly in a couple of weeks' time it'll suddenly send out really long shoots with white flowers, and it'll sort of froth all over the border. It's a beautiful plant. Then at the end of the year I cut it back, I cut it right down to the ground, and it comes up again following May. Otherwise I don't seem to have to look after it at all. It's very easy care. If you'd like to see how the Middlesized Garden changes month by month and pick up some more plant recommendations and ideas of jobs to do, then do look at the Middlesized Garden monthly garden tour playlist. And if you'd like more tips, ideas and inspiration for your Middlesized Garden, then do subscribe to the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.